Thanks for finding us here on YouTube. I'm meteorologist John Dawson. This is the Fox 26 Tropical Update. We're here every afternoon bringing you the latest, diving into sort of some of the details of what's happening out in the tropics. And it's all about the Atlantic basin today. Sometimes we talk about the Pacific, but today we're all about the Atlantic, and there's a couple tropical waves to discuss, kind of bring you up to date on. But first of all, let's just kind of remind ourselves of this interesting pattern that we've seen for much of the summer. And while that's pretty typical that we have this Saharan dust that's fairly thick and fairly prominent across the Atlantic in June and July, typically once we get into August, it really begins to kind of lighten up a little bit and get less of it overall. And well, so far we just haven't seen that. We've still had a fairly active dust pattern, at least in the Atlantic. This hasn't come all the way across and impacted us here in the U.S., but we definitely are continuing to see, especially these pink shading here of this very thick area of the Saharan dust as it moves on through into the Atlantic. So that making it a little bit more difficult for tropical systems to form. So when we talk about our first tropical wave that we're going to be looking at, it's going to be interacting with this Saharan dust, this drier air, and that's going to give it some environment that's not as favorable to develop. When you just sort of take a look at things initially here, it looks like this cluster of thunderstorms would be where the Hurricane Center would kind of keep an eye on things, but there's it's absolutely no organization to that whatsoever, and it's not headed into an area that would favor more development. So this little cluster right here is the area that's actually being watched right now by the National Hurricane Center. Again, this is the tropical wave that's being watched. Again, it's off of the coast, not very far. It's practically in Africa at this point still. It's way out in the Atlantic. So let's zip on over quite a bit closer, and you can see this cluster of storms beginning to interact a little bit with the Windward Islands, and that's sort of giving it a little bit of a difficult time to develop further. But this is the tropical wave that's a lot closer, and this is also the one that the Hurricane Center is monitoring as well. It has some problems to face in its future. Primarily, it's going to be dealing with wind shear. So that's those upper level winds that can make it difficult for a system to get organized and sort of come together, especially I would say within the next 2 to 5 days, or well, let's just say 5 days. In the next 5 days, it's not looking at those favorable conditions concerning the wind shear. It's going to be struggling against that quite a bit. So want to just sort of lay out the official product here that we get from the National Hurricane Center, showing that this is that first tropical wave off the African coast, and over the next 5 days, the Hurricane Center is giving that about a 20% chance of development. So within the next 2 days, only a 10%, and then 20. Again, it's fighting that drier air. It's fighting that Saharan dust. And when we look at that second tropical wave, which is actually the one a little closer to the U.S., it's just now entering the Caribbean. They don't think that it will form for sure in the next couple of days. Again, that's partly tied to that wind shear that I was talking about. But once it gets a couple days down the road, then they're giving it about a 20% chance at the moment. So our computer models, we're sort of seeing those still flip-flop quite a bit on what's happening here with this particular tropical wave, where at one point they would say they're in the Gulf, and at one point they'd say they're not in the Gulf. So it's still interesting enough that it needs to be just sort of watched a little bit and checked in on somewhat. So as we begin to kind of move into the weekend somewhat, don't get completely disconnected from what's happening in the tropics. Take some time at some point over the weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, come back here to YouTube, check in. As I mentioned, we're here every day, even on the weekend. So maybe make it a good Saturday afternoon activity for you to check back in here and see what is going on in the tropics, particularly with that tropical wave as far as its development, if it looks like it wants to get into the Gulf. Because anytime something's in the Gulf this time of the year, us here in Houston and all along the coast of the Gulf of Mexico need to be aware and sort of tuned in to what is happening, because we again get a pretty good idea of where these systems are going, but things can change a little bit. We always want to sort of monitor them and keep a close eye on them. So at John Dawson Fox 26, that's how you're going to find me on social media, particularly Instagram. If you want to follow me on Instagram, that would be great. This is where I do a lot of my hurricane preparedness discussions and sort of ideas of what's happening. It's the Hurricane Gear Test is the name of the segment that I do. So again, at John Dawson Fox 26, it'd be great if you want to follow me on Instagram. We will be back here again tomorrow in the afternoon for another update on the tropics.